Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 10 of our study, which covers the book of Genesis, chapters 17 and 18. In this lesson, we cover a few key points. Most notably, God's covenant with Abram, who becomes Abraham, and the logistics of that, which could seem odd since God just made a covenant with Abram in the last lesson. The same one. Why are we doing it twice? We've talked about it, but this book, and in fact all of the first 5 books of the Bible, are put together from different sources. So, for example, we had 2 different creation accounts from 2 different sources that are, as we talked about, kind of mutually exclusive, right? Like, you couldn't combine those 2 things without messing them up because the details don't match. The order of events, there are things that just don't match. If you combined them, you would make both of them wrong, right? And that's not the point. And it also, as we've talked about, doesn't matter because the way that they're attempting to convey truth and the truth they're attempting to convey is not like literal, factual, detailed, right? It's something more profound about the nature of God and our reality. And again, if you tried to fix the details to make the stories merge, you could and would very easily mess up the more profound truths that the stories are trying to convey in favor of fixing the part that doesn't matter. That repeats here in these books. So we have different versions of this covenant because it comes from different sources, and the author thought it was important. By author, I actually suppose I mean editor. The person assembling the final form of this book from these different writings that were important said, both of these are important, and I'm not going to edit them together. I'm just going to, here's one, and here's one, and they're both important, and you should read both of them. So I'm going to put them here together like we did with the creation stories, and you should read them both together, and it's fine if things don't completely match. And that's not the only time that this happens in the Torah here, in the Pentateuch, and especially in the book of Genesis. We'll emphasize because that's what we're studying right now. But don't be alarmed if things get redundant or contradictory when you're reading this book or Exodus especially, because they do. And don't let it throw you if they don't entirely match. In fact, that's not a thing we're going to worry at all about, trying to reconcile the one against the other. We're not even going to get into that. It doesn't matter. We're going to look at each one self-contained and try to extract from it as much as we can from the one that we're reading. So, that preamble out of the way, we have another story of a covenant, and a few key things happen in this one that didn't happen in the other one. I said I wasn't going to compare, and then it's still helpful to think about, right? But kind of the high points of this one involve renaming and a sign of the covenant, and multiple nations instead of one. And we'll get to those things when we trace through this, but the broad idea of what is a covenant with God, and some of how that works is the same here as it was before. So we won't have to spend as much time or a lot of time at all in this lesson on the concept of covenant. So we'll mostly focus on the what around it, those structures that are put in place to support it, including, like in this one, Abraham and his people have things they have to do as part of it, whereas in the other one that wasn't so much the case. So we'll focus on the meaning of the name changes, why that matters, as the sign of the covenant and some of those things in this version, because those are what the text highlights. So we'll walk through some of those as we get to those parts of the text. The other thing that happens in this lesson that is incredibly noteworthy is Abram intercedes for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah with God. That is if not the model of intercessory prayer. You think, what does it do if I pray for somebody, right? And how does that work? Maybe you don't think that. I do a lot. Because so many things in our faith that used to seem like mysterious as you read and study and reflect more. It's like, oh, I understand the mechanism of how these things work and what it is and how my role in it. But praying for someone else, I don't really. And so often it's just how I'm supposed to. It can be, I pray for the people I love the most, and that's really about me. Or it can be, I've been taught that praying is, I have my list of the people I care about, and I'm just going to go through, and I'm going to pray for all of them, and that's how I pray. And I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm also suggesting that's not maybe a primary how we should be praying and building a relationship with God. But then to me comes in the question of, well, how do we do this, and what's the point? Right? I don't think necessarily all of the things that we pray for all of the people that we're close to are appropriate. Any more than all of the things that we pray for ourselves are appropriate. But I do think it's very, we know, that's one of the things that the communion of saints is all about in heaven, right? These are people who have it made and spend their time praying for us. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. But what are the things that are worth praying for other people, and how does that work? I think matters a lot. And we see here an example of how that can work and what makes it work, in the form of people who are unworthy of receiving the grace of mercy here are granted it on a contingent basis, but it's not because of their own worthiness or even because of Abraham's worthiness. It's because of who God is, and it's contingent upon some other factor that we'll get into. The worthiness or righteousness of some person or people otherwise. Fascinating concept. We'll get into it. But that idea of intercessory prayer and what can motivate and make that work is our other key point here, and I would say the key point of this lesson. The covenant stuff will build on what we talked about in the previous one, and it's interesting. That intercessory prayer part is critical. So that's our roadmap for this lesson here, and we'll work through those points. Here we establish some key points. The first one, we start right away with Abram's age. We didn't in the previous one, we do here. It matters differently here, because as we see, that is going to be a talking point. Both the age of Abram and the age of Sarai are going to be relevant talking points to how this progresses. That's not a random detail. It becomes important. So Abram, 99 years old. We'll just remember that. God shows up, and this time he doesn't say, don't be afraid. He says, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. What's the covenant? We talk about, oh, you're going to get these things. That's not the covenant, right? That is like the fruit or the results of the covenant, right? Like the covenant isn't, here's stuff. Don't you like having stuff? right? That is not what God wants from us or for us, right? Is for us to be rich. We might want that for us from God, but that is not what God wants. What God wants is that relationship with us that requires us being close to Him and free from especially grave but all sin. He wants us to walk before Him and be blameless, to not sin and to have relationship with God. And then failing to do that cuts us out of relationship with God and all of the things He's trying to give us, right? This is that other side of if you sin, you die. And if you don't sin, you live and you thrive in God's presence. This is the covenant, right? It never changes. And that's what God leads with. But we get distracted by all the trappings of the covenant, right? All these things that come along with it. And we think that that's the covenant, and it's not, right? That closeness to God puts you on the pathway that God has in mind for you, and things come along with that are needed to fulfill God's plan. God's plan for what He wants involves a multitude of people who are His people settled in this land. If Abram stays close to God and is going to be involved in fulfilling that plan, he needs to have descendants, a bunch of them, and they need to come into possession of the land. Those things are byproducts of God's relationship with Abram. They're not the main thing. They are secondary things. The main thing is that relationship. That is the covenant. And that gets misconstrued often. I've done it myself. If you focus on, and there are helpful studies of the Old Testament that focus on the development of the covenant from Adam to the time of Jesus. And they take these things that happen as a result of people walking with God, and they focus on those as the covenant. Easy mistake to make, and important to highlight how those things evolve over time, but not the covenant. The covenant is very simply, if you sin, you die. If you don't sin, you don't die and thrive, according to this part too. I don't usually say that part, but that part also is true, depending on what you mean by thrive. But yes. So, Abram, do that, and I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Again, note, I will make my covenant between you, one thing, and will multiply you exceedingly, other thing. Two things, not one thing. Anyway, you all get the point. Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. Again, two things. Very related because of what God's trying to do, but two things, and the covenant comes first. So much that affects our own relationships with God too, right? So Abram's thing is that he really wanted to have a child, right? Heirs that were his. And most especially from his wife that he loved. And that wasn't happening. Note, again, that he gets what he wants, but it is an after effect and a byproduct of his relationship with God, right? Again, a very human thing is to treat God like the wish-granting fairy in the sky, right? This is my thing. I want this, God. Do this, and then, maybe we can have a relationship, right? Let's put the thing I want primary, and then the whole relationship with you, if there's time after, maybe. That is not what Abram does, right? He puts relationship with God first, regardless of whether he gets the thing he wants, and then he gets the thing he wants, but on God's terms. He even tries to do it on his terms, and God says, no, not. We'll get to that here too, but God says, no, not that way, not that. We're going to do it the way you really want, but only after we work some of these other things out and on my timeline. God has a way, when we are walking with him, of giving us what we want. Or, so often, as we get closer to God, what we want doesn't continue to be what we wanted before either, right? There's that too, right? But he doesn't, you're not going to have an incredibly fruitful relationship with God and remain disappointed in the general state of your life, right? There might be things that you still think, yeah, that's not my favorite, but your overall disposition isn't going to be, I hate the state of my life and everything about it. It's generally going to be, I am content and moving in a good direction. And that continues to happen and to grow and to build. But if you make that primary, your purpose for seeking God is to be rich, or to have kids, or to get married, or any of the things you want. If you try to use God to fulfill your own desires, that will not end well, right? You'll stay very unsatisfied and bitter. Again, from my personal experience. But when instead you flip that and you seek a relationship with God for its own sake, and then, God's not going to leave you hanging on the things that are really important to you, right? But that has to not be primary. Can't overstate how important that is, because I see so many people do it wrong, right? And have done it wrong. And we don't talk enough with people about how to pray or how to have a relationship with God or what this looks like. And people are guessing and filling in the gaps, and the media is really bad about how they portray it. And it's nobody's fault if they have a wrong idea about this, right? It's very hard to get a right idea about this, which again is why I'm talking about it a lot. It's not your fault if you have a bad idea about this, but it's also not going to get to the outcome that you want. And the way to get to a really meaningful place personally in your practice of the faith is to make it as much as possible about walking before God and being blameless. And if you can do that, everything else will fall into place. This again is restating those terms of those things that come from God's covenant with Abram. The big point here is that God renames Abram to Abraham, which is great because now I can stop misspeaking on these videos and preemptively calling him Abraham, which I'm pretty sure I did a few times, because it gets in your head, and he is Abraham, right? That's the neat thing about these name changes. They happen a few times in the Bible, and it's always a big deal. Your name is your identity. It's who you are. More in the Old Testament, more in ancient times than now. You are your name, right? It's a big deal. Like, it mattered what Jesus was named, right? What your name is isn't just what you're called, the way they looked at it. It's who you are. And so when you form a deep relationship with God, that changes who you are. So Abram gets closer to God, and now you're not going to be Abram, you're going to be Abraham. And these things are going to happen. But again, all of that is a reflection of the underlying reality, which is Abram, now Abraham's close relationship with God. Close enough that it changes who he is to such a degree that he is given a new name. That's the point, right? That is what we're trying to do, is, again, this relationship with God that we enter into is meant to change us into, we saw at the beginning of this book, we're created in the image and the likeness of God, and we lost that likeness to God, right? Our relationship with God is there to, when we grow and develop in that, as we get closer to God, we regain more and more of that likeness to God. And in doing so, we take on those things that are more like God. How did God make us to be like him? What can we expect to have happen there? The faculties we're given, right? Like the way we perceive the world, the way we understand things, our free will, all of that are designed around the thing we can do that's like God is we can love like God does. We're not omniscient, we're not omnipotent. Other characteristics of God, as humans, we will not ever possess the way that God does, right? We're not built that way, right? We don't have the perception to be omniscient, right? We definitely aren't built to be omnipotent, right? Like, there's no amount of getting closer to God doesn't suddenly like give me psychic powers, right? Like, I don't grow in power when I grow closer to God. I can't suddenly, usually, very rare, gifts of the Holy Spirit and extraordinary graces aside, I can't grow closer to God and then know the winning lottery numbers either, right? Like, the things that I get more able to do as I grow closer to God are to love more like God does. And the closer to God I get, the more I can love like God does. I get more and more like God the closer I get to God. It restores more and more of that likeness to God. But notice, and it's worth reflecting on, where and how that works, right? There are things about me and my identity and who and how I am that change as I get closer to God and become more like God. Those are the things where I am called to resemble and to be like God. And then there are things that stay kind of the same. Those are human things, right? Those are areas where I'm not called to be like God, right? That's not who and what we are. The thing that we are is unfathomably profound. We are beings who are created to be able to love as God loves. And as John tells us, God is love. So being created to be able to love like God does is sharing in the fundamental essence of God as well. It's tremendous. The fact that there are things we don't share with God as well should not in any way detract from we're called to be like God in a very fundamental way to who God is as well. And as we come into that relationship with God then, and as we get closer, we change, right, at a very fundamental level. That is sometimes in the Bible reflected when people are doing that by when they really have changed to a massive degree. It is recognized by saying, you were called Abram, now you're called Abraham. You are a new person because of how much you have changed. And all these other things are going to happen too because of your relationship with God. But the big one is you have the transformative relationship with God. It's reflected in your name change. You are walking with and are in some kind of union of relationship with God. And now other good things are going to come to you and to happen to you as well. Specifically, the descendants and inheriting the land in this case. There's one other relevant point here about this specific covenant and the results of it, which are that it's not just a thing between God and Abraham. It binds and extends to Abraham's descendants as well. And it is on the basis of Abraham's relationship with God that God has further relationship with his descendants, kind of regardless of what they choose to do. Many of them, as it turns out, would just as soon go their own separate ways. But God keeps calling them back and keeps working with them on the basis, again, of this, of his relationship with Abraham is so strong that he says, I care about all of you. And later we see the same thing. For the sake of your father David, I'm not going to do these things to you. And let's figure this out, because I can't just get rid of you because of your father David or your father's father's father. You get it. Because of this other guy who's not you and his relationship with me, you get special grace and privilege. You have extended to you more opportunity to enter into that kind of relationship with God on the basis of behavior of people who are not you. That is very much a Christian principle, right? Like that's the thing, right? Like we all live under the grace of one person has earned God's attention, and we all are cramming in under that umbrella of the merits of the relationship between Jesus Christ and God. And what comes to us is earned by him and not by us. As somebody, as an Israelite, can owe the fact that they have an opportunity to have a relationship with God back to Abram. That is just how it is set up to work. Most importantly, because if those graces and opportunities only came to those who earned them, there would be very, very few people who had any kind of relationship with God. So God chose to extend it beyond that. By virtue of these relationships, when somebody gets it right, are so strong that they ripple through and change our world and our reality. Is kind of the key takeaway there. So here, God provides what is likewise called a sign and later or a covenant and later clarified to be a sign of the covenant, more correctly, between God and Abram and Abram's descendants, and as it turns out, other people living with them, which is circumcision, which is, the text doesn't explain it. I think we all know what it is, right? It's a thing that happens. It is not a thing that anyone would just, especially in the ancient world, that anyone would just sort of randomly opt into doing. Right? This is a big part of what this is, and what matters about it is that it is something that can be done voluntarily, that creates a permanent mark or difference between people who are circumcised and people who are not. It is an irrevocable and binding sort of thing, right? That marks someone as belonging to people of God. There's also, it's tied to the nature of one of the interesting things about Abram's covenant with God, which is that it extends generations, right? And it even creates those generations, right? Abram right now is not having children. He's going to be circumcised, and then he's going to have his promised son. There is, a relationship between what's happening in circumcision and the mechanism of how childbirth occurs, right? Life is involved in this sign, right? as with other covenants, right? What's the last one we had? It's that rainbow in the sky, right? Which is, as we talked about, a bow is like a weapon, right? And it was a promise of not putting to death everybody that way again. Life and death are inherent in all of these covenants, right? And this sign of the covenant has to do with fecundity, which is a part of the promise of the covenant. So it is a fitting thing that marks kind of part of what is being promised. So there's a relationship between the two. It's especially interesting if you start to think that what it's meant to convey or to resemble has to do with fecundity and with generation of something external to yourself. It becomes really interesting to think about what they mean in the New Testament when they say be circumcised in your heart, right? Because they don't mean cut around it, which is what circumcision means, right? Literally what the word means is you cut around something. Clearly that's not what we're trying to do to our hearts. So what are we trying to do? It's to bring forth it's to produce more from our hearts, right? To bring forth, to beget more. That phrase is always a little perplexing if you don't really understand the point of the symbolism of circumcision, right? And what it has to do with. Other point, because numerology is interesting, you are circumcising on the 8th day that a male child exists. Not the 7th day, as creation was. Like we know from later that 8 is the number of, this is really complete, right? Like this is a thing that this people of God, this isn't, we have this one and then we're going to have another one. This is the final version of the people of God that we have here. This is perpetual, this is binding, this is the end thing. We don't have a lot of those this early in the Old Testament. This covenant that is being marked and this relationship with these people, this is not a thing that passes into something new. This is a thing that continues through the generations. And the generations are the essential part of that. Is God's relationship is binding not only on now Abraham, but on his descendants as well. And is binding in the flesh. So it's a big thing that's happened. And it creates a new reality. Something that sometimes we overlook a little bit, at least in how I hear this portrayed, because she's mentioned less, is that Sarai is as important to this as Abraham is, right? Here we see she also is renamed. What if we said that that's about? Is God renaming her for Abraham's sake? That's not how that works, right? That is not at all how that works. And we know from elsewhere that, specifically think New Testament, that the mother of a people that God has in mind, or even a particular son, can be more important, is, in at least that case, more important than the father. Here too, the mother is more important than the father. Abraham has Ishmael, and God's very clearly saying, not that one. This woman, Sarai, now Sarah, has to be with her, that this is fulfilled. It matters who the mother is as much as it matters who the father is. This is because Abraham is involved in that other covenant talk and is the one we see talking to God. We think that he's the only one talking to God. The mother of God also stands back and isn't very involved in what we read in the story. Do we think she wasn't very involved in what was happening? Or that she didn't have much of a relationship with God and was just along for the ride? No, we certainly don't think that. So Sarah is here and is being renamed and is a critical part of this. She's just a little more in the background. But the renaming is clearly telling us she's important. And then we see also a very reasonable and human reaction on Abraham's part when God announces what's going to happen, which is that Sarah's going to have a child. Everybody thinks this is hilarious, and they should, right? The point is we're 90 and 100 years old, and she's well past. That ship has sailed, God. We're not. That's not a thing that is going to happen at this point. And so funny of you to, it's a funny joke you're telling that that's going to happen, because we all know that can't happen. But that's so funny. But Abram also, showing respect to God, falling on his face, showing regard there, but also, especially in the book of Genesis, people laughing is relevant and is fun and comes up. These are very human people who have a relationship with God, and sometimes they find things funny. I don't think that this is meant to be negative at all, this time or the other time that it comes up, right? This is just showing the degree to which they thought this was preposterous, because it is. And they didn't have the long history. By the time we're here and we're used to a God who has raised people from the dead, and we have stories of all kinds of things, this doesn't sound unprecedented. But at this point in biblical history, this is unprecedented. This hasn't happened. We haven't started the long trend of barren women having children with God's intervention. This is the first one. So they're kind of excused for finding it funny and just, sure, God, if you say so. Good joke. And we'll see Abram kind of is hedging his bets here, right? In the next little bit, it's, oh God, that's really funny. But seriously though, Ishmael, right? He's not really, they're not on board yet, because it's preposterous. But again, that is a useful thing to think about God as well, right? Things of God don't always have to be so serious, right? And God made us to laugh. It's okay to find things to do with our faith funny, and to find things that God's doing in our lives funny. Things don't have to be so serious all the time. I think one of the disservices we do to our faith and to how others perceive it is when we get all solemn and serious about it all the time. There are times and places, right? But Good Friday, for example, probably a good time not to be sitting in the Good Friday service and suddenly thinking it's hilarious. Time and a season, but there are definitely places within our practice and exercise of the faith where things are hilarious, and it's good to be able to find humor in them as well. In part because we're so clumsy and don't know what we're doing so much, right? Occasions all manner of hilarity if we're willing to not take ourselves so seriously all the time. This is where we see God has told Abraham what's going to happen. we won't say he's doubting what God said exactly, but he doesn't understand, right? He's somebody who has this great relationship with God to the point that he is like the father of the faith, but that hasn't granted him knowledge or understanding of what God's planning to do, right? This is still so outside of what he can comprehend that he's not trying to doubt God. He just doesn't see what God is saying as a thing that's possible or as a thing that can happen. So he's saying, God, it's all right. I get it. Like, here, I have this son, like, the one that I arranged to have in ways that you didn't tell me to. Like, he's fine. Use Ishmael. That's fine. It'll work. Don't worry about it. Because he's just not seeing. And God says, no, that is not the thing. We are going to use your son with Sarah, the 90-year-old woman who was infertile even before she was 90 years old. That's the plan. That's what we're doing. But, you asked about Ishmael. Yes, we have this covenant with you that has to do with fecundity and many, many descendants and father of nations with that S there in this version. So, yep, I've heard you. Like Ishmael, that'll be a thing. And he will also multiply exceedingly and will make a great nation there, but they don't inherit the covenant, right? The big deal thing, I know you find it funny, we're still going to do it, and it's going to be through Isaac, and then you'll really think it's funny. We're doing that. We're going with the main plan. I haven't talked about it. I didn't talk about it the last time, but this is probably a point to bring up Ishmael a little bit and what happens there. It gets so political these days, and we're not trying to do that in these videos, right? We're not trying to extrapolate all the way to our current modern world and everything that's come about, but it's worth saying that Ishmael is seen as the father of Islam. And briefly addressing an idea here of, are we meant to assume, because a lot can be assumed here that's not probably a good way to look at it, right? What the text is trying to emphasize is only that there is a special binding covenantal relationship of particular favor toward a specific end that is Jesus Christ and the salvation of all humanity, including the descendants of Ishmael, that these descendants of Isaac have a special role in bringing about. It does not limit the overall extension and offering of salvific grace to only those people. We are in a world after Christ. We are in a point where there is functionally no difference between a Jew and a Muslim in terms of their access to salvation and salvific grace, because Jesus changed the rules, right? And before, there also wasn't access to anyone. So even before Christ, there was not a difference in terms of access of salvation and that grace between those peoples, right? God was just tracing through this one line a thing that he intended to do for all of humanity. That's the difference. It's the only difference. So he led those people down a special pathway for the sake of Jesus Christ. And with Jesus Christ, the grace of salvation was made available to all people moving forward and looking backward, right? He harrowed hell. There is no distinction in terms of availability of the grace of salvation between any of these people. It is just that pathway that leads to Christ that goes through the Jews. And we see in and the Israelites before the Jews, right? And all along the way, segments of those people get cut off as well, right? Like you end up with a very small subset of this nation that came from being fruitful and multiplying and descendants that outnumber the stars. That's not how many stay on the path, right? Most of those also get cut off along the way, and you end up with not very many that make it to the end of the path to where Jesus is, right? We keep taking a remnant of a remnant of a remnant of a remnant, right? In these early days, we build up, and then the rest of the history is cutting off and narrowing down until we get to the one. And from the one extends back, forward and backward in time, out to all of them, the grace of salvation, and that's the true promised land, and that's the ultimate fruition of this. So that's why we're not dwelling on Jew or Muslim here, right? There's another thing. Some people have seen like, oh, Abram veered from God's will with Hagar, and like that's what led to Ishmael being a wild ass of a man, and right, like it's sin that extends down from generation to generation to generation. These aren't the people that God chose, right? No. Like that's not, I don't think that's a helpful way to look at it, right? Like, yes, we see especially grace and blessing extending here through generations, but it is for a particular purpose, right? It's for the purpose of bringing about Christ, that goodwill earned by Abram extends beyond Abram, and later goodwill earned by David extends beyond David. Like within the remnants, we pick parts and point back to a person that was important for how that branch continues to develop, but it's for the sake of Christ, right? And that the work of those people is honored. Even the extension of grace is no longer generational, right? That was to get us to Jesus. That isn't now. Like, neither the effects of sin nor the effects of grace can be expected to earn merits or demerits for our children. We're past the age where that mattered, and where it mattered was only this covenant that leads to Christ, right? Like, yes, the behaviors of children are shaped by what they observe in their parents, right? You talk about the argument of nature versus nurture. Both of those things, however, come from our parents, and it can be hard to break free from the influence of our parents. So in that regard, if you have bad parents, it is harder to be good. That is true. You are still only responsible at the end of the day for the life that you live. It's not generational sin. You will not be damned for the behavior of your parents, nor will you be saved because of the behavior of your parents, right? You will be judged only by your own behavior. And it's important that we know, like, every individual has to give an account for their own behavior, and only for their own behavior. With the exception of, if you are one of those bad parents and you do lead your children astray, your own salvation is imperiled as well. It will be very hard to save yourself if you have led your children astray, and especially if you continue to. But that won't, strictly speaking, affect the opportunity for salvation of your children, right? So in that regard, the generational side of that only blows back up to the parents if they fail in their job as the parent. It doesn't continue to the child. Each person is specifically individually responsible for working out with Jesus Christ their own salvation, and no other person's behavior. That's, there are a lot of things in this world people can take from you by coercion or by force. Your salvation is the only one that they can't. Like, your relationship with God and the state of your soul is the only thing that you truly have absolute control and autonomy over. It cannot be taken from you. It can only be given. It ties in with our free will, right? Like that's the thing that relationship with, that identity with, that likeness with God that we're called to build and develop. That's the great gift of who we're made to be, that cannot ever be taken from us. But we can so cavalierly and foolishly give it away. And that's the work of the devil, is to try to say, you could have that, or you could have this pony, which is clearly more, look at it, it's so shiny, and it's, right? Like, and we say, oh yeah, like, I always wanted a pony. I don't need to be like God when I could have a pony. And we make really stupid decisions when shiny things are waved in front of our faces. But that's all the devil can do, right? He can't compel you to sell your soul. He can tempt you. That's why the devil is a tempter, because he can't take your soul from you by force. He can only compel you to make a stupid decision, as he did in the garden and as he continues to do with all of us. He cannot win over us by force, only by coercion. And so that's why he operates that way. But anyway, in this case, worth noting, like, there's no long-term bearing on our world or by access to salvation of any people because of this difference between Isaac and Ishmael, and the fact that God's plan for salvation goes through Isaac. We've already seen that when God gives instructions to Abraham, he doesn't let any grass grow, right? He's a man of action, more than anything else. He thinks God wants him to do something, that's what he's doing. So, okay, God, you circumcision, that's the thing we're doing now? Okay, let's do it. And we also see how much power or influence he has, in that every other male in his retinue does it as well. Abram does it. He circumcises his son Ishmael, and then, hey guys, guess what we're doing today? I know you might have had other plans, but man, better cancel them, because we've got something really fun to do now that God told me we're all going to do. But he's not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you the thing that we're all going to do. And everybody does. That is, generally somebody who could have this kind of relationship with God, and also who thrives in it the way he has, is going to be good to the people around him, right? We've seen that in how he treated Lot. Like, he's definitely not, like, exploiting and taking advantage of all of the people around him. I think it's fair to assume everybody's doing well for their relationship with Abraham. So, it might be, well, that's not really a thing I want to do, but he's a good boss, and, things are going well, and we could be starving or being attacked by all these kings roving around, or, it's not the worst idea. Sure, whatever, right? But more than that view of it, they're binding themselves to worship of Abraham's God too, right? So beyond the cavalier view, it's, we've seen this guy's relationship with God and how it works for him. Yes, sign me up for that. If this is how I sign up, then I guess that's what we're doing. Because I do want in on this relationship with God and what this guy has. And that's where the initial Israelites here are not just Abraham, right? Or they're not Israelites yet. That's not fair, because Israel doesn't exist yet. But these initial people of God are not only direct descendants of Abraham. There's a pathway for people that are coexisting with the people of God but are not involved by blood relationship of birth to become involved by something that is very much involving blood and the mechanisms of birth. It is a way of being born into the people of God without being born into the people of God. And people do it. And lingering in the background is of everything we see that happens later is the idea that this is a thing you can do to become one of the people of God, right? You, from the first time there are people of God, you can enter without being born in. Because necessarily there was a first person who wasn't born in anyway, Abraham, and other people joined up with him. There's a way to become one of the people of God that is not hereditary. And even if you were born into the people of God, you have a choice to make as well, right? Ishmael is Abraham's son and still needs to be circumcised. And you still need to continue to be circumcised. But if you're outside the people of God, you can come inside. And that's the thing that gets, I think, so much is made of the identity of these people as the people of God. As the story progresses, it's easy to forget that there's a way to join up. And that, it's a conversation Jesus has later as well about, well, are you all really so special? Children of Abraham, you can get those anywhere, right? Sorry, John, not Jesus, is the one who brings up that point, but we know Jesus would agree with it, right? And it's when we're switching from one kind of initiation to another, right? It's right on that point. It's John the Baptist, right? And that's how we become new add-ons into the body of Christ as Christians. The point there being made is one that even before you really think you're so special because you were born into and circumcised into Abraham, anybody can be added that way, just like anyone can be added this way. It's not an exclusive club. It was never meant to be. And you're treating it like one, and you're gatekeeping being in the people of God because of who you happen to be born to. But God never meant that. From the very beginning, that is not what God meant. And moving forward, that is not what God means. Anyway, circumcision is a thing that has now happened, and we have people of God. Starting point for this encounter is to emphasize how important hospitality was in the ancient world. This was expected, that you see people and you treat them with kindness and hospitality. It comes from an idea of, now you see somebody going about their way and you assume they're generally going to be okay, right? They have enough to eat, they're safe from danger, basic needs are met. In the ancient world, it was a lot less likely that was always going to be true than it is now. And so it becomes an expectation among somewhat civilized people that if you see somebody, you make sure their needs are met and you hope that they would do the same for you, right? It's a way to make sure that, everybody is at least a little bit okay. And if something bad happens, that like you can kind of hopefully count on, like if you're traveling and you lose your stuff or whatever, that you can count on somebody to help, right? Um, and it just became ingrained in especially Middle Eastern cultures that is what you did and were meant to do, which is part of what makes the next lesson story of Sodom and Gomorrah so appalling, right? Is it's a violation of that fundamental idea of his hospitality, along with all the other things that we'll get into in the next lesson. But this is how it's supposed to go, right? Oh, you're passing by. Do you need something to drink? Do you need some rest? Can I get you something to eat? Right? Are you okay? Right? This isn't Abraham seeing these three people and saying, this is God, I should suck up to God, right? Like, it is unclear. We know. This is a story where we know this is God in the form of three people. It is unclear that Abraham knows that. And they have not identified themselves as such. I think somewhere in the story, it seems like Abraham figures it out, because the later exchange he has definitely makes it clear that he knows that he's talking to God. But at this point, he's not behaving this way because this is God. He's behaving this way because he's the kind of guy who would behave this way to a stranger. And that it's important that that's in the backdrop of this encounter, right? Because if Abraham, I'll stop doing it, really. If Abraham hadn't been that good guy and God had passed by without being welcomed, would the next part have happened? Would Isaac have happened, right? There's kind of a test here where how Abraham and Sarah receive these strangers, leads directly to Isaac. And it is Abraham and Sarah, right? Abraham sees the guys and says, oh, we should take care of you. But then Sarah does the work as well, or is involved in the caring. And it's not servants, right? Servants do some of it, but Abraham and Sarah are directly involved as well and in taking care of it. They definitely could have had servants do it all, but they're welcoming directly into like their company these people, and Sarah's cooking and Abraham's working as well. Like, they're not delegating this. They're showing a great deal of welcome and respect to these people. It's important to note that. It frames the whole thing that happens, right? Other part of this, a lot is made of it. It is fascinating. I don't know how much can be gleaned from it. These are three guys that are God, as it's portrayed. You know, sometimes we've seen God appear, and later we've seen the text has changed and it's been an angel. And in kind of here in Genesis, the two are not necessarily, the lines are not so separate, so we don't know the exact deal of who or what this is, but it is God or a representative of God presenting as three and representing one. And it has been viewed, not wrongly, as a first manifestation or implication of the idea of Trinity. So make of that what you will. It is an interesting choice for God to present as three, however he's doing it. And that's not really a thing that happens, but it does here. And I guess, and the three speak with one voice, right? It's not like we give them three different names and we have the guy A says this and then guy C says that. Like, they're not all involved in the conversation and given separate parts, right? They speak with one voice. We've got three guys, but I was mixing them up and conveying them as one person because that's how they communicate. And that's how the story represents them, is basically you've got speaking roles for Abraham, Sarah, the three guys, as one line. And they're portrayed as one. So you kind of have a 3-in-1 scenario. Anyway, it's interesting, not worth dwelling on too much, but certainly worth noting a little bit. So Abraham and Sarah show hospitality. Now then, they lay out in one voice that when they, in the first person singular, I, will surely return to you in the spring, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. The point we've been building to. And Sarah overhears this. She's been, she's in the tent, but she's been listening to what's going on. And her reaction, like her husband's previously, is to laugh. It's funny. Note, they ask, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I don't think they're chastising, right? You can view this as chastising, and Sarah, tries to deny, saying, no, I didn't laugh because of it. But I don't think that it's a bad thing that she laughed, and I don't think the Lord is in any way offended that she laughed, right? I think this is just a teaching moment that is, you think this is funny because it's preposterous. Should it be preposterous to you, considering who your God is, that this could happen? Maybe not. Maybe you shouldn't be laughing at how unlikely or how impossible this is. Because, God. But that same thought, it's aimed at Sarah, but Abraham had the same reaction, right? So the point is directed to both of them, I think. And if Sarah makes any mistake here, it's denying that she laughed instead of just saying, yeah, sorry, well, let's see what happens in spring. You've got to admit it seems kind of funny. Would have been, rather than I didn't laugh, probably would have been a better look on her part. But can you blame her, right? 90-year-old woman being told by random strangers who are visiting, this time next spring you're going to have a son. That is crazy. But also, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. But we know this is God speaking, so we know that that's what's going to happen, right? But we have the benefit of knowing that's what's going to happen that Sarah and Abraham don't have. So even with some relationship, and we have the benefit of knowing they're talking to God, which it's unclear that they know they are. So really, they should get some leeway in this, and it's just highlighting this is just a truly preposterous thing, and those are God's specialty. And impossible things are not impossible with God, but you have to have that perspective. It's probably in this exchange also that they start to figure out who they're talking to, right? Or start to get a real sense that, oh, this isn't just a stranger. This is God's involved in this, because this is the promise that he made to us, and there's something to these guys. Something's going on here. So there it is, promise made. So Abraham is traveling with these men, and God is speaking to him, and the relationship between that is still a little interesting. And God is laying out what he has in mind, which is he has heard complaints, outcry about what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. and he intends to intercede, to investigate. There's a strong implication that Abraham picks up on, that the investigation is more than just a fact-finding mission, and that it involves some kind of remedy of the situation as well, likely of the murderous kind. We'll get into that with Abraham's conversation with God. But at any rate, God decides to let Abraham in on this plan, right? And he says, well, if we're making a great nation of the sky, and we're going to do all of this through and with Abraham, and he's chosen, then he should see how this works, right? Especially because, maybe we need to do some sort of thing like this with some of his descendants sometime. They should have an idea that, you still have to toe the line here and walk the straight and narrow a little bit, and that when you don't, bad things happen. But it is kind of, generally if you're led into conversations of great and powerful people, God being the greatest and most powerful, that is a sign of your own position and status, right? So Abraham has made this covenant with God. He's been renamed. This is like he's invited into a conversation and a council that he previously wouldn't have been, right? This is like he got a promotion, and this is the reflection of that promotion, and he's the new guy in the room, right? Which makes the next thing that happens all the more interesting. But at any rate, God lets Abraham into the idea that he's going to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah, look at what's going on, and the implication is strong that he's going to do something about it, assuming that it is bad. Perhaps the most interesting part of this very interesting passage is this first verse. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. I thought these men were the Lord, but of course he can be in as many places at once as he wants to, and the Lord has been speaking. The relationship between God and these three men who are and aren't the Lord, mostly are, is odd, right? They definitely are representatives of and are the Lord, but the way Abraham is used to talking to God doesn't involve the intermediaries either. So they can go away, and Abraham can continue his conversation with the Lord just as well as he did when they were there. But it is an unusual thing that raises questions about God and Abraham's relationship with God, especially how casually Abraham seems to see the three people he's been talking with and walking with, that by now he must know have involvement with God. They just pass on their way, and then he's alone, and he just continues talking to the Lord like he was when they were there. Great. Interesting though, right? Worth calling out, interesting, not worth digging into more than just to note that an unusual thing happens there that's super easy to read over. Beyond that, intercessory prayer. Again, Abraham, the new guy in this conversation, says, hold up, God. As I understand this, you will punish the unrighteous, but you're not about punishing the righteous people, right? So that's how I understand this deal, is if I'm righteous, you don't want to punish me. So what if there are people down there who are righteous? You're surely not going to punish everyone then, right? What if there are 50 people down there who are righteous? It starts as kind of, you could almost see it like he's framing it like a question of, just want to make sure I understand how this works, right? But it's also, he does understand how it works, right? So it's also, this is a way that you can suggest a course of action to people in higher rungs of authority than you, right? By asking the leading question, by saying, well, I know we don't want to do this thing, right? So what about other thing? And you can instead, because you can't tell people in higher authority than you what to do, right? Like you can, but that is a really bad look. And nobody appreciates that, right? And they're not going to do it either. So the best you can do is try to convince. And that's what Abraham does here, right? He acknowledges it's God's decision. He is basing what he's asking on his understanding of who God is and how God operates. And then he's asking, just so we're on the same page, based on how I know this works, if there are 50 righteous people down there, you're not going to kill them, right? And God says, oh yeah, you're totally right, Abraham. That's not how we do things here. If there are 50 righteous people down there, we'll spare them all. So we don't accidentally kill some of the righteous people. So we'll go down, we'll check it out. If there are 50 down there, everybody's off the hook. You're right that we wouldn't want to drag the righteous into it with them. And then Abraham, okay, 45. If that's what happens with 45, with 50, and there are only 45, are we saying we're going to damn all of them over 5, a difference of only 5 people? Really? Because that's not how I think we operate either. And God's, you're right, definitely on behalf of just the difference of 5 people, we're not gonna kill everybody. And then Abraham plays a game of continuing to suggest, well, what about 40? What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? And every time God says, yep, you're right, we're not trying to punish righteous people with the wicked. Totally right, we won't kill any of them if there are 10 people. The really fascinating thing about this is that's where Abraham stops asking. We don't know. He doesn't get to a number where God says no. He stops asking when God still says yes. How low does the number go? We know that answer because that's like part of the fundamental element of Christianity. We know 1 is the answer. If there is 1 righteous person, God will spare all of the others for the sake of the 1 righteous person. That's the foundation is there. The conversation stops at 10, and God goes on his way. And then so many years later, Abraham's descendant shows up and says, so God, what if there's only 1? Then will you do away with all of these people when there's 1 righteous person? And God continues his answer and says, no, if there is 1 righteous person, I will spare them all for the sake of that 1 righteous person. And then God's son, who is also a person, says, well, you're looking at him. So spare them. There are other components and other, that's like the most complicated thing ever to happen in human history. So there are a lot of other angles to it as well. But this is one of the angles to that, right? This is foreshadowing of a thing that happens later. It shows us a key thing about God, and it foreshadows a thing that is to come. It's very much Christological in its implications. Beyond that, I teased in the intro that this is also a great example of intercessory prayer, right? It is not, note, Abraham is not claiming by any act of his that any of these people should be favored by God. He's not, God, you and I are kind of tight now that we have this covenant thing going and you gave me a new name. So how about for my sake, you leave these people alone? No. Doesn't make that claim, knows that that's not a thing that works, right? You can't make those requests for your sake or on your merit. If Abraham can't, I can't. What he presumes upon is God's own nature and mercy. And fascinatingly, the righteousness of some other hypothetical people, right? It's, God, you're this way, but what we need for this prayer to work is we need 50 or 45 or 40 or 30 or 10 righteous people for this to work. You need merit. Righteousness is required for this to work, right? It's not just, who Abraham is doesn't matter at all. Who God is matters greatly, but it's not that in and of itself isn't going to change what God was already going to do. God, you know everything and we're already going to murder all these people. Please don't. There's no reason there to change God's mind, which is, God doesn't really change his mind, but that's, in interceding, that's sort of what we're asking, right? We're on path toward outcome A, and we want to go to outcome B, and so we do need something to be different than it is, and we need God to sign off on that. And what does that? What turns the direction? When it's not God and it's not me, it's the one righteous person, right? We're appealing to Jesus Christ has the ability to, by virtue of who he is, to change course of what is otherwise going to happen. And the people who are spared don't have to be righteous because the one is. He has merited and earned grace that can be extended to people who don't deserve it, and not because of me, and still very much in line with who God is, but not just because of God either. The righteousness of one person can change the direction of and the fate of others. When we're interceding, that's what we're asking. The thing is, that's not something to do lightly, right? What is it that Jesus did that merits that change? He died violently. You're asking a favor of that, powered by and deriving its effect from his passion, death, and resurrection. So, just firing off 40 prayers at once for different people on your way to sleep, because that's, what you think you're supposed to do, is presuming a lot. It's not to say we're not invited to and called to pray and to intercede for others, but we should be mindful when we do of who and what we're asking. And it's a big thing, right? It's not just, just like the stupid pony examples, you're not asking a sky wizard to snap his fingers and to change something, right? There has to be something that drives and powers that change. You're asking Jesus to share the grace of his suffering and death. And if you're doing that by going through a checklist of people you're praying for without investing yourself as much as you can in what you're asking, then you might be out of line. Another component of this. Note here in the story, God's original intention and will is to burn these cities and everyone in them to the ground, which is what happens. But, spoiler, none of us knew that happened to Sodom and Gomorrah before I spoiled it, I'm sure. It is also a thing consistent with God's will to not do that under certain conditions. You have a scenario in which God's will can accommodate multiple courses of action, right? To burn them to the ground or not to burn them to the ground, or to remove the guy that Abraham cares about. It's unclear that he's considered righteous, although he behaves okay, and his family before burning them to the ground. There's a spectrum of things that can happen that are consistent with God's will, and his, let's say, inclination is pointed toward burn them all. And what we're asking is not for something outside of the spectrum of outcomes that are consistent with God's will, right? Like, we're not asking for a thing that goes against who God is. That would also be inappropriate, certainly. But within the range of what could be possible and allowable within within the framework of who God is, we're asking for something that might not be where we're headed now. A thing that we also hear brought up is, and this is definitely how I have spent a long time doing this, and I'm thinking about it now and thinking it might not fit, is saying, oh God, your will be done for this person. I wonder about the efficacy of that as well, because, what was going to be done otherwise, right? God doesn't have one will. Because of our will, there's a range of, let's call it, allowable zone within which God will let something to happen. So we don't, if God's, here on burn them to the ground, and that's okay, we're asking for God to do something else that's also within the realm of God's will, right? So maybe just saying God's will be done is a little too much toward, yeah, go ahead and burn them all. And that's what we're asking is, don't burn them all. And so it can be okay to be specific or to make suggestions like Abraham does here. The intention is good though, right? Like, to specify and be clear, God, I definitely don't want you to do something for this person that you're not okay with, right? Like, I think that's the intention of that. It certainly was when I've done it. And that's good and well-meaning. But the point of the prayer is also, I want something to be different from what seems to be happening. And I need you to be involved in that, God. And the basis, the thing that drives that, the power that brings about that change, because I don't have any ability to do that, is Jesus Christ, right? So there are so many moving parts here, but it's not just, I think it's probably, we should do more than just say, thy will be done, right? But you shouldn't be praying, God, my uncle's scraping to get by, make him rich, right? Like, and so those prayers can turn selfish when we step outside of wanting it for the other person. Or, you know, probably one of the better intercessory prayers that we've had is Saint Therese of Lisieux, right? Just a sickly nun who struggled some even with basic self-care tasks, and by some accounts was like, she just seemed like she didn't have it together that much at all necessarily in her life, but her relationship with God, she's a doctor of the church. She had profound insight into God. And she, there are examples of her reading a newspaper article about a convicted, rightfully convicted person who was, I think, going to death row or being put in prison or something. I can't remember the details. And she took it upon herself to pray for that person's soul, right? That is intercessory prayer, right? Things along the normal course of action, this guy is justifiably on the pathway to damnation. Through his own actions, it's merited, burn them all. There's a world in which God doesn't want to burn anybody and would love to bring salvation to the world. But that's not the pathway that this is on. St. Therese is saying, God, look at this guy in your mercy and with your power. Could you intervene for this guy? And he did. Because he loved her who was asking. It was consistent with his will, and it was the grace of Jesus Christ who brought about that salvation, right? That's how that works. But she also took the request very seriously and prayed for him a lot, and not just again throwing out, when we do this, it shouldn't just be, and I'd like to pray for my brother and my dad and my mom and my grandma and my wife and my kids, and that's not, I don't think that's fruitful. And I think people do that and they don't see fruit in it and they think prayer is pointless. And that's not the right takeaway, right? You praying badly isn't enough reason to think that prayer doesn't work. It's a reason to think you don't know how to do it and you're bad at it. And maybe don't keep praying the same way that doesn't work. Also, it can take a long time, right? There's also the story of St. Monica, and it took a long time for that to work. And what she put into that is part of why it had the result. So there can be times where we're praying well and it doesn't work right away either. And so it's hard to, in direct contradiction to the thing I just said, it can be a thing that takes time, but if, you're never seeing any results or outcome from your prayer and you're not really putting that much into it and it's not working, maybe don't say prayer is the thing that doesn't work. Maybe you are the thing that doesn't work. And these saints' relationships with God help them know how to communicate with them and to get his attention. It's also worth noting, again, the words aren't what matter, right? It's not, I didn't say it right, or I need to say more to God to make this work, right? Again, how we do it, a lot of very profound prayer can be wordless, right? And, again, there are vocal and verbal prayers that are also effective, but usually those are meant to be memorized and rote and repetitive so that your mind can do other things and your soul can do other things while you're saying them as well, right? To keep it fresh and dynamic and effective, When you're praying, you also probably want to, like, you're not just saying words and hoping that that does the thing because you said the right words, right? Like, that's not the important part of it either, which is again where going on that checklist of saying I'd like to pray for this and saying those things and checking them off is like so contrary to the point, right? So more than I meant to talk about prayer actually through this whole series so far on Genesis, but it's been there, it's important, and nobody teaches us how to pray, right? And so it ends up being something we all sort of have to figure out for ourselves, and it can take a long time, and we can do a lot of bad or silly things along the way. I think maybe the takeaway is praying for other people is good. Key point, I want to make sure I didn't convey the contrary to that. It is good to pray for other people. It must be done seriously, right? Like, in the Old Testament, if you're a priest and you're seeking reprieve for somebody's sins and you're offering a sacrifice, right? That's how you do it, right? You offer a sacrifice. If this prayer is driven by the sacrifice of Christ and you're the one presuming to offer that prayer, you're entering into a priestly role when you do it. And be mindful of the sacrifice that you're invoking, is what I would say there. Don't do it lightly. And be willing in that prayer to be both priest and sacrifice yourself. I think if we approach that with that mindset, then we might take it as seriously as it's meant to be. And in that regard, like, God wants us to be offering intercessory prayer for the world and for others, but we have to orient ourselves correctly toward it. And again, the end of that prayer should be the salvation of the world, not someone's financial situation or even their health. I know we like to pray for people who aren't well, and it's not a bad thing to do, but, and I'm not trying to be cavalier about this part, but does it matter? Like, what you want is for people's souls to be healthy and well. And if they are, then the rest of it, does it matter? Like, what do you really want for these people that you love? You want them to be safe, happy, well, forever. Maybe don't pray for less than that for them. Maybe pray for the thing that really will meet the need in a way that lasts forever, and not for something that somebody could get healthy now and they're still going to die, right? Somebody's soul can be saved now and they'll never die. Pray for the things that God wants for everyone and work toward them. And I think our prayers will be very fruitful. Don't, and maybe pray for something else, and maybe don't be surprised if it falls on deaf ears. This has been an overview of Lesson 10 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.